Okay. Hello and welcome to day 3 of the Young World Federalist Global Assembly. Today we're talking about the pathways to a world federation, and we have 3 esteemed guests who I'm very happy to introduce you all to. And I'm very thankful that they came. So our first guest is Sovaida Ma'ani. She's the author, speaker, and international lawyer and founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, a virtual think tank that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. Her latest book is The Alchemy of Peace: 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace, which is available on Amazon. And she also hosts a live video podcast called Reimagining Our World on Facebook and the CPGG YouTube channel, which is linked in the description of the stream. And is dedicated to infusing hope in these turbulent times. Our next guest is Andreas Bummel. He is the co-founder and director of Democracy Without Borders and the Campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. From 1998 to 2018, he served on the Council of the World Federalist Movement. He is the author of the book, A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century with Jo Leinen, and is considered one of the world's leading experts on the subject. Our last guest is Professor Tim Murthi, and he is the head of the Peacebuilding Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and an extraordinary professor of African Studies at the University of Free State in South Africa. He has over 26 years of experience in conflict resolution, peace building, security, governance, transitional justice, and development in Africa. He has held positions at the Department of Peace Studies in the University of Bradford in the UK, Center for Conflict and Resolution in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town, Institute for Security Studies in Addis Ababa, United Nations Institute for Training and Research in Geneva, and he is the author and editor of 11 books, including The Ethics of Peacebuilding, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, Peacebuilding and Development, and The Politics of Transitional Justice in the Great Lakes Region. And you can find him on Twitter at @tmurithi12. Okay, so that is the introductions, and I thank you once again all for being here. So first we're going to start with some short presentations or speeches from our 3 guests, and then we'll break into a Q&A. So please, I turn it over to Sovaida. Please, thank you.
Well, thank you, Easton, for that very gracious introduction. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with the 2 of you, Andreas and Tim. And hi, Jorge, you're here in person, and Charles. Okay, so we were sent a few questions to respond to in the form of a short presentation. So I'm going to get going. So starting with, how do I believe that a world federation will be created? And I think it maybe the question was intended maybe to mean, how do I believe it ought to be created? So I think the starting point is a recognition and an acceptance of humanity's unprecedented interdependence and interconnectedness. As Kishore Mahbubani, the famous Singaporean diplomat and academic, said, humanity used to be 193 boats bobbing on the sea of international life, just concerned about not crashing into each other. But we've now become a ship with 193 cabins. And although each cabin is internally regulated very well, unfortunately, the ship as a whole lacks both captain and crew. So when we are tossed in turbulent storms, the fate of the ship is at stake, and there's no one to take it to safe harbor. And we've seen this in spades with the pandemic. We're seeing this in spades with climate change, with global economic recession, with the threat of nuclear proliferation, and on and on and on. There are a whole host of existential global challenges that face us. Once we recognize this reality of our interdependence, and also recognize that most of our current challenges are global in nature and by definition demand collective and global solutions, which requires that we collaborate, cooperate, and consult, we realize that we're at a point where, unfortunately, we're lacking precisely those mechanisms by which we can achieve this kind of collective decision-making and enforcement. So having said that, having created that understanding, because that's the why, and unless people understand why, they're not going to move to the how, and that's why I start with that. The next step, I think, is as follows. This is what I would propose. I humbly put it forward. It's just an idea. Pick a narrow area like climate change. And having done that, establish a body that is elected the way the high authority of the European coal and steel communities, which was the foundational community of what we know today as the EU, was created. Create a high authority, or really, this would be really the nucleus of a global legislature. A high authority that is directly elected by the peoples of the world, by people in each country, so representatives would be elected in proportion to the number of people in each country. So this body would have democratic legitimacy. And then granted certain key powers, the most important of which is the power to pass binding legislation in the narrow sphere of climate change. Now remember, we're picking one narrow sphere where there's a collective global interest, which is climate change, in which cannot be resolved by any one or any group of nations, but has to be resolved with everybody participating. So give it the power to pass binding legislation in the field of climate change. So to tell nations, basically, to decide how much fossil fuel each nation can burn, how to ratchet things down so we get to net zero emissions by the time we're supposed to get to them, say by 2050, to determine what to legislate on the kinds of energy that we can use in what amounts, that would also have the ability to be funded. So it would have the right to a certain limited form of taxation on all individuals around the world. So just like we're taxed in this country locally and state-wise and federally, this would be another layer of taxation in this limited sphere so that we wouldn't have to worry about funding. So we could also fund research and development into alternative renewable sources of energy. And we could fund, the migration of people who were displaced from their homes. We could fund adaptation, and on and on and on. You get the idea. So by doing this, we tackle the dual problems of democratic deficit and legislative deficit that we currently see with our system in the United Nations. Now, as this body develops capacity and confidence and wins the trust of the international community, we can consider adding to its powers in further areas of collective interest that require swift and effective collective decision-making. One of the other questions was, well, how does the UN fit into the creation of this federation the way I have envisioned it? Well, I would say let the UN be for now, let it continue to do its things. I'm very skeptical about the ability of the UN itself to radically transform in all the ways it needs to in time to meet the existential dangers facing humanity today. If we were to rely solely on UN reform, we're going to need massive reforms such as changing the way the UN General Assembly members are appointed, from being appointed government officials to elected, to be true representatives of their people, to give the UNGA in its new form the power to pass binding legislation in narrow collective spheres of endeavor where only collective action will work. And to then give it the ability to enforce its legislation, because as Jean Monnet, the founder of the EU, one of the founding fathers, recognized, there's no point in creating international treaties if you don't have any power to enforce them. To be given, the UNGA would need to be given limited powers to tax. It would need to act as the trustee for the world's most important natural resources, and on and on. The Security Council also would need to reform. We'd have to convince the nations who have veto power to let go of it. We need to create an equitable voting structure. We need to give them a means of enforcement. The World Court would need to be overhauled. We would need to have compulsory jurisdiction, change the way judges are elected, which is really now in practice in backroom deals. I saw this firsthand when I worked at the State Department in the legal advisor's office. So can we get there in time? I doubt it. It would be wonderful if we could, but I think it is too vested, bloated a bureaucracy. People are too vested in their interests, the turf they have. It's going to be very hard to turn this ship around. But they do a lot of good work in a lot of areas that are not considered existential threats to humanity. So I say, let's let the UN do the great job it does in the spheres that it does function well. Start building this new system with experimenting with a global legislature and slowly expanding its purview, very much like the European coal and steel community developed. And then we had the atomic community and then the European communities. The evolution of the European coal and steel is really a good story. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, I've written a couple of books on this, Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises, and also Bridge to Global Governance, in which I unpack this. How else would the UN need to change? Well, there are three legs, if you like, to the stool. A reform generally at the global level needs to, whether we're starting with something anew or reforming an existing institution like the UN, there are three legs we need to focus on. One is institutional reform that I have blasted through because of shortage of time. The second is we need to build these institutions on the basis of a set of shared global ethics. And this is another really critical topic. The nations of the world have to be able to come together, identify a set of global values or ethics that they can agree on, like the oneness of humanity, equity and fairness, that the advantage of the part in an interdependent world can only be guaranteed by the advantage of the whole, because we're like a body. And we're prone to systemic risks, and we need to recognize that the body can get cancer. And once you get cancer, it doesn't make sense for the kidneys to say to the liver, I don't care if you're diseased, I'm out for number one, kidneys first, which is what we do in international politics, which is kind of crazy. So identify them, achieve consensus around them, and then apply them methodically to solving any global challenge. And the third leg is to paying attention to the quality of leaders, because you can design the most perfect institutions that do the most perfect things. But if the people who become their members, who man and woman these institutions are corrupt, then the institutions are going to fall into the same old trap. So this involves a lot of we need to educate the grassroots. How does grassroots activism fit into the creation of a world federation, you ask? Well, by raising awareness about the options we have, the costs of continuing as is, and the benefits of making changes, being transparent and telling the truth, galvanizing and focusing public opinion so that we elect leaders who are fit for purpose, who have the capacity and motivation to do the difficult things necessary. Think about climate change and what you're witnessing, Easton, in Glasgow right now. Leaders who have the qualities of courage, truthfulness, ability to think long-term and act before an emergency is an emergency, who are able to take us, as Rosalind Carter says, where we need to be, but we don't necessarily want to go. That's what the job of a leader is, to get us there. And our leaders have abjectly failed in their collective responsibility, and whose motivation is to serve the collective good, free of ego and self-interest. And that's another one of the banes that we're seeing. What can youth do? Absolutely vital role. I think that the future of our world is completely dependent on the youth. You guys can start, you have so many options available to you. I think you've got a great role model in Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future that she's created. The organization, they only started in 2018, And they have already got 14 million active members, and they're able to organize grassroots movements and put pressure on policymakers. So education is key. Use whatever tools are at your disposal, especially social media, websites, platforms, protests, whatever the tools are. Education, and turn out to vote for fit leaders. Don't sit on the sidelines. So get each other truly to understand your civic responsibilities and duties and get engaged. So, you know, TikTok, Instagram, etc., videos, blogs, live streaming as you're doing all of this, and collaborating horizontally. So I think my time is up. I took 11 minutes. And I colleagues a chance to speak.
Thank you so much. That was very enlightening, and I have lots of questions. But before we get to that, I'll give the floor to Andreas Bummel. You are muted, Andreas. There you go.
Thank you, Easton, and to the Young World Federalists for organizing this panel and inviting me. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you on your first Global Assembly online, and also the enthusiasm and activism that you are bringing into the movement as a new organization. For my entire adult life, I have been puzzling over this question of how to achieve World Federation, and I have devoted most part of it so far working on this goal. Democratic World Federation, in my opinion, is the only way that will allow humanity and life on Earth to prosper in the centuries ahead. Right now, we are in the middle of a crossroads, and the path that is taken in the next few decades will decide whether humanity can take the step of creating a global polity, or whether our planetary civilization will slowly and perhaps suddenly break down. I understand that the discussion today, purpose is not to examine the rationale or the necessity of world unification, but rather, or the failure of the Westphalian international order, but rather to look at strategies that we can pursue to achieve World Federation. And in short, I would say that democracy is a precondition, the path, and the goal of any viable World Federalist strategy. And let me elaborate on this. As a starting point, we first need to make clear what our understanding of World Federation really is, I believe. As far as I am concerned, I subscribe to the outcomes of the theory of change process that was undertaken by my organization, Democracy Without Borders, in the past year. The long-term goal adopted in this process is described as follows, and I may quote: the creation of a democratic global constitution with a citizen-elected world parliament as centerpiece of a legitimate, accountable, and representative world organization, which is based on the principles of equal global citizenship, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, the rule of law, fundamental human rights, and the protection of minorities. The description goes on to say, which is very important, that this organization should have effective and universal authority over the regulation and management of issues of global concern, which simply means the authority to adopt binding world law. From this, it follows that achieving and strengthening democracy in all countries on this planet is a precondition for the conception, for this conception of World Federation. World Federalism really needs to be a movement that puts a focus on strengthening democracy, in my opinion. If civic and political rights are denied and suppressed in a given country, citizens of that country are cut off from participating freely in any global democratic polity. For instance, they will not be able to participate in democratic elections for a world parliament. This situation would violate the notion of equal global citizenship, human rights, and rule of law, among other things, and it would violate the basic values that give a world federation legitimacy in the first place. I can only touch on the surface now, but I believe that the global polity that has the ability to adopt binding world law must be based on component parts, which is nation states in the federalist sense, that themselves are also democratic. In a world federation, as I understand it, pockets of despotism are completely unacceptable. The idea that it is possible to simply ignore and bypass existing countries is one of the biggest fallacies in world federalist thinking, in my opinion. Governments control taxation, redistribution, the use of physical force, rulemaking and implementation. A world federation a federal order, a world federation needs their support and involvement. Now, secondly, let me talk about democracy as a path. In world order activism, there is a tendency that groups will come up with some blueprint for world federation, and then they will advocate for its adoption. Such blueprints may be a good thinking exercise, but it's certainly not a useful strategy, in my opinion. Democracy as a path, to me, means that world federalists should help establish and facilitate the broadest possible consultations on a future global constitution. Creating a constitution is not an academic exercise, it is political. It is a matter of bringing together and including major stakeholders, balancing their views and interests so that they feel represented in the process and in the outcome. Only then they will accept the result as legitimate. Of course, we want a world federation to be based on the consent, at least of a big majority of all citizens on this planet. It cannot be imposed top-down. In my mind, a global constitution will not only need to be ratified by nation states, a certain qualified majority, 2/3 probably, but in addition, it should be subject of a world referendum, which will enable all citizens to vote yes or no on the constitutional document. Now, thirdly, democracy as the goal is very simple, and I already elaborated on that. As far as I'm concerned, world federalists are striving for global order and a global polity that is democratic and based on popular consent. Let me use the last few minutes for some more reflections. As world federalists, we should never forget about our guiding vision, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge the realities of the world as we find it in front of ourselves. There is a trend of autocratization right now and a trend of nationalist populism that runs counter to our goals. The climate crisis is happening now, and we cannot wait 10, 20, 50 years for a world federation to emerge to deal with it. There are growing international tensions and geopolitical struggles. There is militarization of space taking place and the modernization of nuclear weapons. There's dramatic inequality, ongoing extreme poverty and hunger in the world. For sure, a world federation would address the root causes of all of this, but we need to be smart, patient, and strategic in advancing our goal in this very challenging environment. Now, finally, as most of you will know, one of the main projects I am devoted to is the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And to finish my presentation, I would like to tell you why very shortly. As a force of democratization, a UN Parliamentary Assembly can help with creating the preconditions for a World Federalist strategy. Once established, it can then be a key institution that paves the way and mobilizes for a global constitutional process with substantial democratic legitimacy. And finally, as a precursor of a World Parliament, a UNPA would already constitute a big step forward towards realizing the actual goal of global democracy. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Yeah, you unfortunately addressed a lot of my questions, so I'm gonna have to rack my mind here. Okay, next I turn the floor over to Tim, please.
Thank you, Easton. Thank you for the invitation to join you here today to share a few thoughts with you on the pathways to world federalism or world federation. So I think in the past, I've really looked at this issue from the perspective of addressing the historical injustices of the exclusion of quite a large part of the world, notably Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in terms of participating in global governance. And I've written a lot about it, have been on conversations and panels with Andreas on this issue. I've also looked at the issue from the perspective of creating a global democratic community to address a lot of the issues you've heard Andreas and Sovaida too is referred to, climate change, violence, illicit trade, so on and so forth. We've also worked extensively on proposing reforms to the United Nations Charter, including the establishment of a world parliament with legislative powers and committees with the financial resources to address global challenges, which always stirs a lot of debate and perhaps some controversy. So I'm not going to repeat any of that today. Perhaps for a change, let's talk about something completely different, which is, and since I'm on a panel with young World Federalists, I do want to look at the issue from outside the box. Perhaps one could say even from outside the planet looking in, and in particular from an extraterrestrial perspective, if you will. On the 18th of October, 2021, that's about 3 weeks ago, the administrator of NASA, Senator Bill Nelson, who's got about 40 years of political experience, mentioned that he was convinced that we were not alone on this planet based on a New York Times article going back to the 16th of December, 2017, which I've posted in the chat function, in which the US Navy reported sightings of more than 300 unidentified aerial phenomena that they have confirmed are real. And more recently, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence of the US in a 25th of June 2021 report mentioned that they, in fact, have identified 144 sightings formally recorded by multiple sensors, that there is some kind of interstellar engagement from their perspective taking place at the moment. I think you might be familiar with the Harvard professor of astronomy, Avi Loeb's book, in which he published, called Extraterrestrial, referring to Oumuamua, an extraterrestrial, if you will, ship that seemed to visit the planet. And so another pathway to World Federation, as I mentioned, slightly outside the box, is looking at this issue of how would humanity, in fact, engage with an extraterrestrial civilization if indeed this is what's happening. So I'm not saying it's happening. I'm just saying this is a thought experiment that we should engage with. If there's an interstellar civilization that is in close proximity to the Earth, that has achieved interplanetary travel capability and is now reaching out to us as human beings and gradually making themselves known, what should be our response as a people? And it does raise questions because we currently do not have institutions that can actually engage or represent us as a unified body of people, if such a phenomenon, in fact, was in fact taking place. There's a professor at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law, Daniel Dresner, who's written that the real reason UFOs have been dismissed is because of the existential threat that they pose to our worldview, in which human beings are the most technologically advanced life forms in the world, and so in the universe, I would say even. And so there's a huge amount of work that needs to shift the human mindset to accepting that perhaps we're not alone in this vast universe, and elsewhere around our galactic neighborhood, there could be a society or civilization seeking to engage us. And so there's a lot of work from the perspective of social scientists, academics, to work on issues that relate to human relationships and preparing the ground for such a potential exposure to an interstellar civilization, which is, if Bill Nelson is correct, imminent. And so we mentally need to prepare ourselves for such an earth-shattering, you will shift, but there's a lot of ridicule and there's a lot of stigma still attached to this issue. But I still think it can help us to think outside the box in terms of what are the priorities and the needs in terms of world federation. We currently do not have any institutions as humanity to engage as a collective body. In fact, the United Nations, you've heard, is this fragmentation of 193 different cabins. So what happens if this phenomenon in fact reveals itself? Who is supposed to speak for us? It can't be just one country or a small group of countries. It needs to be some kind of a collective body that represents us all, at least a world parliament at the very least. And so we have a major gap in terms of forward planning and preparing the policy, scientific, societal constituencies to engage with such a potential outcome, also socially and culturally, in terms of media engagement. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for potentially what could be a globally game-changing event in terms of the way we see ourselves and the way we, see our place in the world. I know there's a lot of, controversy around this. There's a religious scientific dogma that even questions the possibility of otherworldly civilizations existing. But, as Professor Michio Kaku of City University, New York, has argued in his book, The Future of Humanity, is that we need to actually start mentally wrapping our heads around this idea. There is a United Nations Office for Space Affairs. So beyond reforming the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly and creating a world parliament, we need to start thinking about institutions that can actually be also engaged by citizen groups like the Young World Federalists to raise awareness across different communities around the world. Everything that Sovaida mentioned about, engaging social media, raising awareness, and developing some kind of a framework for us to function as one, because, in the event that this happens, we will be caught off guard and we will be split into all sorts of different, dimensions. So that would be my take really on really what are some of the outside the box approaches to pushing us towards greater world federalism. It's not an issue that's looked at a lot, and it's an issue that's quite controversial. You will find the documents in the chat. You can download them and engage them for yourself. In particular, the report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is very clear in terms of what it states. And I think that should be something that we should consider going forward. I'm going to stop there, Easton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for, yes, very out of the box perspective. But I have to say that many of the Young World Federalists do, share the views of especially, enamored with space travel and going into space and all this very futuristic thinking. So, it's totally welcome here. So before I wrote down a few questions, but before we get into that, let me make sure that I switch the view that everybody can be seen. And I just wanted to open the floor to anybody else who had any questions for our guests. So please go on ahead, and if you have any, or just questions amongst yourselves, if you had any comments back at each other, I'll give it a moment. Okay, that's all right. So just to get the discussion started, I wanted to ask, going back to you, Sovaida. You talked a lot about sort of institution building outside the UN, in particular, an international sort of environment, high authority, so to speak. And I'm wondering how the existing sort of the UN environmental program is sort of an existing body that could be reformed, or a lot of people talk about, there's a big movement here in Glasgow to make ecocide a crime. So to add ecocide to the International Criminal Court's sort of list of things that can prosecute. So those are reforms sort of within the current system. And so I'm wondering how those, why do you recommend going outside?
So good question. I think the approach that we're taking with what we have, I know the guy who's spearheading, one of the fellows who's spearheading this whole movement to creating a new crime of ecocide. He was one of my professors at Cambridge, and he's always been very creative and somebody who thinks out of the box, Philippe Sands. You know, we're taking a very hodgepodge approach to tackling some critical global challenges. So some guy somewhere starts with an idea of, oh, we should add a crime of ecocide. So off we go. It takes us years and years and years and lots of working committees and papers and trying to convince people. And that is one element. I mean, it's a wonderful move, don't get me wrong. But wouldn't it be fantastic if we worked on the nub of the fact that we are lacking a collective decision-making mechanism that is able to pass binding legislation? Imagine if we had a world parliament right now that recognized that, oh, one of the things perhaps we need to do is to pass a law on ecocide, as opposed to having this very fragmented approach. Reforming current institutions. Again, I'm not sure how the current UN agencies would lend themselves, that the process it would take to move them to the point where they had a legislature that was able to pass binding environmental legislation on all the nations of the world. I think you're going to get a lot of reaction to that, negative reaction to that. And it's better to take a coherent, cohesive approach to all the existential problems of humanity and start with the kernel of an institution that can then be grown and grown out so that eventually we can, as I say, go from strength to strength and cover all the existential problems, as opposed to doing them piecemeal. The scattershot piecemeal approach, it doesn't sit well with me. You know, we tend to do that in our individual lives too. We don't stop, very few of us stop until we're hit by a crisis in our lives, either a divorce or cancer or something horrible. We don't get off the treadmill and stop and reflect on what is meaningful to me in life? What are my values? What is the vision of where I want to end up? And then where am I now? What are the choices that got me here? What different choices can I make to get me from where I am to where I want to be? And this is what we need to do at the global level. We need to have a global think. And you know, Andreas's point that we need to recognize that one of the linchpins for this to work is that we need to have a body of equals, of nations where, you know, you have democracies and where citizens have the freedom to choose and participate in elections and are on a par. So there's a lot of global soul searching and reflection in some sense. I think the blessing of COVID and climate change is that they're forcing a humanity that would rather kick the can down the road and not reflect to recognize painfully and being dragged, kicking and screaming through it, to the recognition of our oneness, which is really the founding principle underlying democracy, right? When you truly understand that as human beings, we are one, then you're onto something. Then you start to embrace democracy and democratic institutions and democratic governments and democratic societies and so on. So these are, I think, we need to do a global think. I wanted to tie it in, if I may, to something Tim said. I love, Tim, the fact that you really kind of put us on the edge of our seats. And it's like, okay, and now for something completely different, as John Cleese said. So yes, and what I would hope, again, is that we would start the process of reflection and making empowering and constructive choices for our collective futures, not driven by fear which is a possibility when one starts to think about, oh, extraterrestrials, like, oh, well, we better bandy together and create unity so that we can speak with one voice, as opposed to embracing it and saying, wow, wouldn't that be amazing if we had there other sentient beings? And so just as humanity has, its history has been an evolution of integration and unity, as Andreas said, we're on a process of unification, starting from the family to the tribe to the city-state. You know, the circles have been widening, the nation, and then we kind of got stuck at the nation. And now we need to owe our greater loyalty to humanity as a whole. And then we can then countenance the idea of then widening the circle in a very positive way to include the extraterrestrials at some point, right? Unification of the planets. Yeah, there we go. Now we're into Star Trek and whatnot. But why not? As long as it's driven by something positive as opposed to fear, because I think that would be unfortunate. Fear-based decisions are generally not very good decisions. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, anybody is more than welcome to jump in at any time. Yeah, please, Jorge.
Thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. They were really interesting. Yesterday, we had another one about civil resistance, and I have a question related to that, because we were seeing how the World Federalist Movement, or with different organizations, has been organizing activities and trying to widespread this idea ever since after the Second World War, or even before the Second World War. And he proposes to go for a civil resistance. And he put an example, which I really like. He talked about Gandhi and India's pursuit of independence. And he said that once there was the proposal to go for a constitution to achieve independence. And that Gandhi denied that this was the pathway towards independence. He said that first, Indians had to raise awareness of the injustice that was taking place, and he chose salt as an example of the injustice which was taking place. And this was the Salt March that we all know. And we were thinking together yesterday which could be the salt that we could raise in our movement to achieve world democratic federation, which could be this injustice, which we could showcase through civil resistance to show that our current system is not enough and that we have to improve it. And I wanted to pass you that question, and yeah, which could be our salt? Thank you.
I think it's a great question. Does anybody have any in the, Andreas, please, yeah.
Yes, I mean, if you allow, I would like to offer some reflections on the presentations and the discussion, which I found very inspiring and interesting. First of all, perhaps on Tim's subject. It was in 1987 that then US President Ronald Reagan, in a speech at the UN General Assembly, actually remarked that if there was an alien threat or even an alien existence, that would mean that the differences between the USSR and the USA would quickly diminish, and they would, try to find ways to confront that together, and world would become a unity. So I think that is really true, because an outside existence, an outside threat, even in just the awareness of an outside entity, has always, in the history of social political integration of humanity, played a crucial role for the formation of collective identity of groups. And this is exactly one of the biggest conceptual challenges that we are facing with world unification, because such an outside entity exactly does not exist. So there's been, some substitutes that have been developed in theory, like the outside threat, that's ourselves, which is an intellectual exercise. We are causing the climate crisis. So we need to confront it. We are ourselves the threat, but also another substitute that was developed is that temporarily, at the temporal level, that the actual threat that we can confront is ourselves in the past. Like in Germany, it is part of collective identity now that that Germans, they would confront the crimes committed by the Nazi regime and resist them as part of their identity formation. And so this whole question of an extraterrestrial existence, I think, is highly relevant conceptually. And for me personally, it has never been a question, considering the vastness of the universe, that there is, for sure, intelligent life somewhere. However, whether that life is able to come here and communicate with us is a different story. And I mean, for the sake of it, since it's been raised, there are different theories what this UFO phenomenon could mean. It could also be, just to introduce that, I am enjoying this, it could also be ourselves visiting us from the future, which honestly, given the distances and our current physical knowledge, I even consider that more likely than some extraterrestrial intelligence coming from, I don't know how many million light years, distance. Anyway, so this is one thing. And I really think this conceptual challenge is key in world unification. And one bridge to the idea of starting small with a subject issue like it has happened in the European coal and steel community is a recognition that European integration was also driven by an outside threat, which was the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union. To no small part degree, that was really driving it forward, among other things, and of course the experience of the Second World War and European countries, being at war at each other. But this also was driven by an us-them distinction. And one remark about the European integration process, which I find is really relevant. I mean, I agree to the Jean Monnet generally approach. However, I don't think it really applies and works at the global scale now. And that's because we lack this common value that has been talked about, which means there are countries that are violating human rights, in the strongest ways. And European integration always was driven forward by democratic member states. Now, where, in Poland and in Hungary, there is, some kind of democratic setback, the European Union, you can see quite clearly what kind of challenge that is for the European Union. And globally, that's the problem, that has been, economic integration and all sorts of collaboration, but politically it is so countries are too different. And I don't think really, and there are also studies about this, how do autocracies engage with other countries? I don't think that autocratic governments are ready to actually transfer sovereign powers to any higher entity. I think that is quite clear and sure that won't happen. But the problem is, and then I stop, I don't want to give another lecture here, presentation, but the problem is really that even the most democratic governments on the planet are not ready to do that either. So I think we are developing here some good approaches and ideas, but the reality on the ground is that even the Paris Climate Agreement is voluntary, because there was no consensus, and no government would be willing to accept any higher authority that is adopting binding regulation without the governmental consensual approval. And that is the reality we need to face. And here comes in perhaps this idea of civic resistance, which I think is extremely important. But if you look at, India was mentioned and Gandhi, revolutions and civic resistance in most cases has had a subject, that it was directed against, and like the government, the colonial administration in the Indian, colony at the time, for instance. And the problem is, for a global revolution, we don't have such a center to revolutionize against. We do have, in my opinion, we do have a kind of global government already in place, but it is extremely intransparent, opaque, it is informal, and it is hard to say, this is the body we need to fight against. And that's why I believe perhaps what we really need to do is we need to support those democracy movements that are actually already on the ground, like in Myanmar, like, Chinese oppositional, exile, pro-democracy people. That's the people we need to support. So that bottom up, our resistance is directed against the existing totalitarian regimes that we have. And if we can get rid of them, next step will be to build some global unity. Thanks. I'm sorry this has dragged on along,
Thank you very much. Yeah, please, Sovaida. And then I wanted to give the floor to Tim if he had anything to respond to some of the comments. But yeah, Sovaida, please.
I just wanted to loop back to, thanks, Andreas. Yeah, this is really very thought-provoking. So let's look back to Jean Monnet. When he came up with the ideas long before the Eastern Bloc was a threat, and he used to go and harp about his ideas, and everyone would say, it's actually very interesting reading his autobiography and biographies of him. People would say, oh God, here comes this guy again. He's got these harebrained ideas that none of us are willing to accept. And Jean Monnet himself in his autobiography says that I deliberately did this because I understood one thing. And that was that while people in that moment were not ready, and they had all the reasons, like all the reasons Andreas has articulated, we have autocratic governments, and autocratic governments aren't willing to cede sovereignty, and even democratic governments aren't willing to cede sovereignty. Look at the Paris Agreement, etc. So all of these great, and it's true, all of everything you say is true. And yet Jean Monnet said, I knew that all of this was going to unravel, and these systems were going to unravel at such a speed that it would bewilder all of us. And he said, all the people who today were the naysayers and would say, oh, we're not ready, it's not time, look, the values aren't, the shared values aren't there, that this isn't there, that isn't there. He said they would be so stumped by what to do when everything crashed around their ears that they would be the first person, give them any plan and they'd be willing to implement it. So he says, I'm standing ready with my plan so that when the collapse that is inevitable comes, I know that those very people will adopt it. We have seen this in our lifetimes. I saw this with the downfall of the Berlin Wall. All the experts who talked and had, positions and were experts, and governmental experts, think tank experts, academic experts, none of them saw it coming. The end of apartheid in South Africa. Again, all the experts, none of them saw it coming as quickly in the way that it did and as quickly as it did. So I think that we are, when I look at history, I see that humanity is kind of evolving towards a state. We're going through a turbulent adolescence, if we like, but we're approaching a stage of collective maturity. And that maturity, I firmly believe, is coming. And all of this stuff is going to fall of its own accord. It is going to fall under its own weight because it is by definition unsustainable. So I believe in creating the vision and a plan of something that will come so that when what we have fails, humanity can say, okay, now we know we have to have a very clear vision of what we're moving towards. So yes, we're not ready today to have elections worldwide for the members of a world parliament, but we need to start instilling these ideas and getting it out into the ether and helping people create the vision so that when the system, it's already collapsing, but when it irretrievably collapses and they are convinced that now they need something else and they're desperate, they have a vision, because hope is such an important component of we're not doomed. There is something else. Arnold Toynbee, the famous 20th century historian, wrote about this in the 70s. He believed that the solution to humanity's problems was the creation of a world government. And he said that we are allergic to the idea of a world government. You raise it and everyone says, oh my gosh, no way. And he says, the good news is this is just a bad habit. And that once we're faced with existential threat, he said, humanity, he predicted, would turn on a dime and be willing to adopt, even though unhappily, the idea of a global government, because they realized it was the only solution. So I say, let's paint the vision, let's create some, talk about the basic components. We may not be ready to start today, but I don't think it's going to be that long. Andreas, you painted a timeline of, the next few decades. Well, gee, the next few decades is not very far away. And between the catastrophe that is climate change, the Paris Agreement, the way it is, we're even if we fulfill all the pledges, which is a big if, we're on a trajectory to have 2.7 degrees centigrade global warming beyond, which is catastrophic. So what we're doing now just isn't working. And we're going to suffer. We're already suffering. We're going to suffer in ways that we can't imagine, and our world is going to be unrecognizable. So.
Thank you for the very optimistic perspective. So I'm just kidding. Tim, please, if you wanted to respond to anything, I'll. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. No, I completely agree with what Sovaida's just said, and also what Andreas has put on the table. I think absolutely concur. We're very much aligned. It sounds like we're all singing from the same song sheet, which is good. Nothing wrong with that. With what Sovaida's just said, I think the global catastrophe is already here. It's already happening. Some of the small island nations are actually shrinking as we speak, and even certain coastlines, like in even Miami, Florida, is actually under threat. Certain parts of the world are faced with this catastrophe, which is really happening. And then to witness COP26 was quite disappointing, really. The strategy the governments went in there with was to actually downplay the possibility of any great outcome. And every COP we go in and we think, oh my gosh, nothing is going to happen. And so, yes, Paris is there. Yes, America's back into the Paris Agreement, but still, there's a serious global inertia. I mean, take the really uplifting speech by Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and you would think that he's going to now get a whole of government approach to actually dealing with this thing. Just like shortly after, they're going to move straight into all major reductions, getting into renewables, living up to the International Panel on Climate Change 1.5, which is really also quite low. And then what do we find out in parallel during that same COP26? His minister was busy signing an oil deal in the North Sea. So we're in a bit of a conundrum. These governments with the rhetoric are really not, they're not pushing the envelope as far as we think they will. And my concern, Sovaida, is if we wait until there's a real catastrophe, we might not be able to recover from it, So I think beyond just waiting until the bow breaks and, the floodgates have been opened and the world is now swamped beyond recognition, I think we should also strategize as to how we can pour some fuel into the fire of pushing towards World Federation. So it's a slightly more aggressive strategy because nothing's really happened since 1992. We've been talking about it since 1992. And I remember we were very optimistic in 1992, by the way, with the shift end of the Cold War and Glasnost, Perestroika and all this, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But nothing's really shifted significantly. If anything, emissions have increased. more trade, more mining. Antonio Guterres' speech was quite poignant in that sense, but it looks like very few people are actually engaging with what he's saying and utilizing it to mobilize. So my point then basically is that we need to just use as many conceptual and theoretical and argumentative tools as we can. And I think the reason I'm trying to push outside the box is that it just opens up a different channel of conversation. And it's good to hear that both you, Sovaida, and Andreas are at least aligned with the argument, the conceptual argument. It's not a bad argument. It's not even a strange argument. It's been around for a very long time. So it's not something new. I think what is different is that you don't hear it in polite circles. You don't hear it on Zoom conversations around, the global democracy. And so we need to start changing that, actually. And actually, it's a challenge to Easton and the young World Federalists that I think this is something that you guys can push the agenda a little bit more in terms of just expanding the debate and challenging others to take on different conceptual perspectives. I think this is very important to put. I'm not going to say mainstream extraterrestrial discussions in the Young World Federalist program, but at least to put it out there as an issue for your colleagues to think about. I think it's very important. Look at some of the work that's being done by Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard University with his Galileo project, which has been funded to the tune of $2 million. And what they're looking for are using the astronomical tools that they have to actually try to locate UAP, to actually photograph it so that you have concrete proof that it's out there. So I don't know how many years it will take to get there, but in the meantime, we can start pushing the envelope a little bit to get this conversation going. I think as young people, you probably have much more license to do this than some of us slightly, if you will, experienced, shall I say, colleagues. That would be my take on it, because I think we do sometimes tend to preach to the choir, we preach to the converted, and we wonder why what we're singing sounds so harmonious, but no one else is really picking up on it, I think that's a challenge for us to actually think about and engage with. Thanks, Easton.
Yeah, thank you. What Andreas said about it kind of resonates with me about sort of intelligent life off of Earth. Sort of, in a way, it represents sort of the lack of intelligent life here on Earth, and sort of encapsulates the same existential crisis in a conceptual sense. And I wanted to turn it back to Andreas, actually, because I'm actually quite interested in this sort of pro-democracy element that you talk about. So first of all, is a strategy of electoralism in the playbook of starting political parties, or how much should we support certain candidates for office and political parties? But I think what I'm more interested in is sort of the geopolitical aspect of it. And so essentially, if just for example, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but if the World Federalist Movement became, World Federalist in democracies, but then in authoritarian countries became basically just a pro-democracy movement, how does this overcome the us versus them sort of geopolitical divides that we have, the sort of democracy versus authoritarianism divide, and then turning to the League of Democracies, or more integration of the world's democracies? To me, that looks a lot like trying, especially language around trying to contain authoritarian countries like China. Containment was the ideology behind the Cold War. So I'm just interested, how does this not replicate the same mistakes of the past?
Right. I think that's really on point, because there needs to be a serious reflection on democracy support and promotion since the end of the Cold War and before, which is not happening. And it is true that those approaches towards this topic that are discussed at this time among governments, the D10, the Summit for Democracy, they are really, in my assessment, to a large degree, based on geopolitical motives and not necessarily on actually strengthening democracy. Because if the latter was the case, the countries engaged in these efforts would also have to pose the question, in how far has there been a democratic backslide at home in their own countries, and why? In Western developed industrial countries, for instance, the question would come up about the squeezing of the middle classes, for instance, and austerity policies and all that. So I think that an honest effort to support democracy should, as you rightfully point out, attempt to get out of this geopolitical trap. And so it would have two dimensions, actually. One is to look at democratic backsliding at home of those countries concerned. And secondly, only, how can we support and promote democracy abroad? And containment, I mean, to a degree, I think it is a problem that if on the one hand, you would promote democracy and human rights and as a value, and on the other, as a government, you don't care whatsoever what governments you are collaborating with economically and in other spheres. So I do think that to a degree, there needs to be a more forceful approach, but one that is really honest, and which includes the self-criticism. And as far as the World Federalist Movement is concerned, I don't think that this is really something that concerns partisan politics, or let's say, if possible, it shouldn't. So I wouldn't say that we would, as a pro-democracy movement, necessarily support specific parties or candidates, or even less set up such structures and candidates anywhere. But I think what we can do is really engage with the existing global democracy movement, and also such that exist and related to countries, and strengthen their awareness and commitment to the idea that global and national democratization are connected. For instance, how can democracy cannot thrive in an undemocratic global system? That would be my thesis that we can discuss. And so any advocate of democracy actually should subscribe to World Federalist ideas if World Federalism is shown to actually be based on the democratic idea. And well, one more thing, the League of Democracy is a project that I personally do not support for various reasons, even less if it concerns some kind of merger of NATO and OECD. And I don't think that democracy has ever been a real driving force in international politics. If you look at BRICS, although they are on a downward trajectory, but BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China collaborating. I mean, why would South Africa collaborate with a country like, in this sense, with China and Russia? It's merely for geopolitical purposes. Russia and China are amongst the worst human rights offenders. So a democratic foreign policy of South Africa wouldn't probably put any emphasis on BRICS. And so I think this whole idea that, which comes mostly from former Commonwealth or existing Commonwealth countries, interestingly, it won't lead anywhere, because that isn't sufficient. I rather think that perhaps regional integration that puts democracy in a focus will work. So you would have two components, the regional identity, perhaps identity building, and a commitment to democracy in the regions.
Thank you. Very good. Jorge, I saw your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to ask a question.
It was exactly what you asked about a global league of democracy.
Okay.
But yeah, Andreas already addressed this.
Okay. if there's any more questions, we do have a question from the chat that said, let me see if I can dig it up. Oh, okay, so it's from Robert, and Robert says, what do you think are the main obstacles in getting the undeniable existing youth movements that are concerned about global issues to buy into the idea of world federalism? Is there anybody who wants to take, maybe I can bring that to you, Sovaida, because you're talking about, value building and things like that, and maybe perhaps the idea of world citizenship. So we can maybe frame that in a way of how do we sort of build the shared ethics of world unification and human unity with other movements that are very active and large, as we pointed out, that are more concerned about specific issues. So maybe if that makes sense.
I think we've probably not done as good a job as we need to. So this is just a challenge and an opportunity to do better, to really paint a compelling picture of why the answer, really the only viable answer to all of the various issues. People are very issue oriented, but it's the reason why I actually wrote the book, the small book, Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. It was an attempt to demonstrate very practically why creating a global federation would help solve a series of crises, whether it was the global financial crisis, whether it was nuclear proliferation and threat of nuclear holocaust crisis, whether it was the terrorism crisis, whether it's the pandemic crisis, it really doesn't matter. So the beauty of working towards a global federation is you get to the root of a problem. See, when you're dealing with all these issues, it's like tackling various disease branches of the tree. But when you get to federation, because federation is really ultimately about further integration and unification of humanity, and unity is actually the solution to all of these problems. Once we find a way of collaborating and consulting and working together, we can solve whatever the problem it is. You have everybody's voices are included in a world federation once we have laid the democratic groundwork that Andreas has been talking about. But once we get to a world federation, a democratic world federation that is functioning the way it should, then we're dealing with the root, where we have a healthy tree. So all of these symptoms start to disappear. So I think that is, that's the way to go. It's creating a compelling picture and reasoning, providing sound arguments, demonstrating why this is really, and it truly is, I believe, the only answer. Everything else is, again, another scattershot approach. Not that they aren't helpful. Putting band-aids on things is helpful, but it doesn't actually deal with the root cause of the problem. I also just wanted to very quickly say to Tim, I'm not at all advocating that we wait for the catastrophe to happen. What I'm saying in answer to Andreas, who said that, oh, we're not ready yet, is to say we still need to do this work of creating the compelling picture, starting to take steps in the direction of, but for those who are naysaying, we shouldn't be thwarted and shouldn't be hindered by their negativity, because we know in the end they're going to come to, and we need to be ready. So absolutely, no, we need to be, and we need to quote you, be more aggressive in our approach. Absolutely, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and it's heartening to hear people finally, when I was talking about this in 2002, traveling around giving talks about the need for a world federation and warning people about climate change, and it's an existential crisis, and people looking at me like I'd lost my mind. It's nice to see that at least now we're getting to a point where people are recognizing this. But anyway, I think for the youth, Easton, that is there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Yes, there is lots of work. Yeah, and I just wanted to actually echo what you were saying to Tim about that. And I am reminded of a really great sci-fi movie called Arrival, which has the aliens coming and they can't speak to them. It's like a language thing. It's actually a pretty good movie. But there is a moment in that movie where geopolitics get involved, and you have like all the countries of the world in a Zoom call, and they're trying to debate how to basically respond to the existential threat. And they couldn't agree, and all the countries just left the Zoom call basically all at once. And so it sort of exemplifies getting caught on our back foot when these existential threats occur. However, one could very easily argue that we are getting caught on our back foot because of the existential threat that climate crisis poses. So it's a great metaphor to relate it to the other global problems that we have. I don't know if Tim, you wanted to respond to that, and I also saw Andreas had his hand up. So Tim, if you have anything to say.
Sure. Yeah, I think also the question that was put to the team. I think the biggest challenge is what is the compelling argument to move away from the nation state towards world federation? That's a difficult one because we're dealing with a very deep sense of identity. But it's the same question that was asked in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, when all the city-states kept battling with each other, causing a lot of havoc and causing a lot of destruction. And they figured, okay, we need to come up with a system that will just at least create some degree of territorial integrity and sovereignty, so we don't have this recurring wars that just keep happening over and over again. And now we are faced with the same challenge in this era of making the case for the next leap from the nation state to the World Federation. And it's an argument, I think, I agree with Sovaida, that we're not that effective at communicating why it's so important, why it's so urgent. And in the absence of being able to communicate that, then people revert to their national identities, even deeper ethnic identities, which are now they're almost surfacing. A lot of ethnic chauvinism is surfacing all around the world. And you almost have a sense that the world is splitting into those who do feel that we need to move towards a global democracy, cosmopolitanism, world federation, compared to those who want to retreat back to what they know, what they're comfortable with, what they feel secure and safe in. And they don't want this huge anomalous entity that they don't feel that they can actually influence or control. So we have to find ways to make that argument much sharper. I mean, everything that's been said, is a good argument for it. Now, we still need to sharpen that argument. I think I like the global citizen campaigns that have been happening, the world concerts that have been happening all around. I think that's definitely a pathway. The social media campaigns, absolutely necessary and crucial to, and also for individuals to call out, this the nationalist chauvinism, the ethnic chauvinism that when it emerges, to counteract that, to call that out. That's an individual responsibility. So we have to be doing that regularly. And then we need to sharpen just why we are, in fact, one unified entity. It's easier to make the case if you're on one of the Bezos or Branson or Elon Musk's spaceships flying out, looking back in. When you see the Earth in unity, you're like, wow, it's just us. I don't know. These lines we've drawn on the surface are really devastating and destructive. So I think we still need to sharpen that argument much more, because when you put the argument for the nation state against the argument for the World Federation, I think the World Federation argument always comes out second and slightly weaker and less coherent. And I think we need to just keep on sharpening that argument and saying very practical things. I think Greta Thunberg's approach of almost saying blah, 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 and the world is hurtling towards more climate catastrophe, is not bad. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I'm kind of moving quite gently towards that slightly more aggressive posture of saying, the world is in dire straits right now, and if we don't work as a collective and we keep coming with our flags and making all these speeches, we're just not going to make it. And then we need to engage. I don't think we should leave the conversation at this level at all. We should definitely be engaging with very high levels, governments, trying to look for those nation states that are champions from within the United Nations system that will actually push from the inside. This is the work that Andreas has been doing really well, and some recent pronouncements, like the one by the UN Special Rapporteur, I think, on the World Parliamentary Assembly, definitely moving in the right direction. And I think we should keep pushing that agenda in that way. So the shift of consciousness, that's the challenge. If you don't shift the consciousness, you can't shift the identity. So to shift from the national identity to the global identity, we need to shift the consciousness. I was on the panel with Andreas last year on whether COVID was a wake-up call. We had a bit of a debate. I thought COVID personally is a wake-up call, but others might take a different perspective because it attacks everyone the same. So I mean, it's like, what more do you need? What more proof do you need? To recognize that we actually one humanity and not all these small fragments that we've designed by ourselves, really. Yeah, let me stop there, Easton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to I saw Andreas, you had your hand up.
Well, that is true. Our discussion has moved elsewhere in the meantime. I mean, we can perhaps get some more questions if there are any, and otherwise I'm happy to volunteer with some more reflections.
Yeah, if there's any questions from the floor, I think I've asked all of mine, but yeah, Andreas, if you'd like to do some reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I need to repeat and insist on this point, really, that in my opinion, one of the biggest obstacles is really the governments, and in particular, autocratic governments. I would like to recall that his historical scholars have been digging up an assessment that was made by the US State Department, I believe in 1943, on the post-war world order, which in fact did examine the possibility of promoting a world federation. However, that study came to the conclusion that with the Stalinist USSR and other undemocratic countries, such a world federation was not desirable and not doable. And I think, I mean, we are living in a different time, and our own assessments of the past at the time will be varied, but I stick to my thinking that we cannot achieve a transformed UN and a democratic world federation that has the ability to adopt binding regulation, and as long as major countries are still dictatorships. So this is really, I believe, something we need to tackle. And this is also, by the way, a point that is put forward all the time, even in my day-to-day encounters with diplomats and politicians, right? Democratic politicians are not open, and rightfully so, to entertain the idea that democratic countries would join a supranational authority that includes, dictatorships. That is just not going to happen, in my opinion. And we need to face this.
Difficult to face. Donna, please ask if you have a question.
Well, can I reply to what Easton just said? I mean, I know I'm not on the panel. Is it okay if I reflect? Or
yeah, sure, yeah.
Andreas said that he thinks the biggest obstacle are governments, especially autocratic ones. Certainly that is a problem, but here in the US, it feels to me like the biggest, well, I don't know, there's so many problems. The power of the military industrial complex in the US is a bit overwhelming. I'm not sure that our democratic government isn't one of the biggest obstacles, because it isn't really democratic. I mean, that's the problem, is that even in so-called democracies, there's power in money. The government, the corporations it's very challenging. And I mean, I certainly don't. I've heard that China, according to Dina Freeman, who I was speaking to recently from One World, was telling me that her understanding of the Chinese is that they would be willing to have democracy at the global level, just not within there. And I see Andreas shaking his head. So I am just repeating what I've heard Dina say. So I don't know. There are just so many problems. It's hard to find the biggest one from my perspective. Perhaps Andreas could respond, because I see him shaking his head.
Yeah, Andreas, before you go, just quickly, and then Sovaida, and then Jorge.
I mean, maybe Tim would like to elaborate on Gaddafi, Libyan, dictator Gaddafi's idea of a democratic African Union. I mean, this is really propaganda. You cannot, I mean, of course, China and others, by the way, would say, we love global democracy and we want it to happen. And why would they do that? Just to embarrass the West, which does not want that either. It is Cuba and undemocratic authoritarian countries who set up the special mandate in the Human Rights Council for the promotion of a democratic, equitable international order. And the West, European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they would always vote down the resolutions coming from that mandate in the General Assembly. And so we really need to be smart about how to interpret what's coming from them. Of course, China will say that just to embarrass everybody else, because they know exactly what's going on. I cannot respond for too long, but I would be really, you cannot take it at face value at all.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And I know you have to go, so I thank you very much for your time. And Sovaida,
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas.
Sovaida, please.
So we're now getting into the weeds of if you just listen to the last 7 or 8 minutes, we've told ourselves what all the seemingly insuperable obstacles are. And wow, they exist. Not only is it the autocratic countries, but wow, we even our democratic countries. So, for those listening, those young folks, please don't pull your hair out and say, well, this was a great intellectual exercise, and now we can go home and be depressed. So I want to zoom out a little bit, because my shifting mindset. So I've been doing global federalism work for 20 years, coming up with strategies and tactics and institutional reforms and how to shift people and principles and all these ideas. And I finally concluded after 18 years of doing it that none of this was going to work until we were able to help shift certain critical mindsets that people had. And I identified 6 major obstacles. It's just, again, one person's thinking contribution of old mindsets that have led to old dysfunctional habits and how to replace them. So one of the things that occurs to me that it would be good, behoove us to think about is, as we observe everything that's going on in the world, including the latest moves towards more autocracy and more, populist, right-wing populist governments and so on, and more egregious human rights abuses, is that what we're witnessing is a dual process of integration and disintegration that's going on simultaneously. On the one hand, we're seeing all our systems, environmental systems, political systems, social systems, economic systems collapsing under their own weight. And on the other hand, we're seeing a lot of new, beautiful evidences of integration. One example was COVID, with the scientists who for the first time in history came together and collaborated, putting aside their egos, putting aside their interests of needing to have their names on the paper so that they could win that, have a chance of winning that Nobel Prize, collaborated across boundaries, and were able to come up not just with one, but with several viable vaccines in 11 months, as opposed to the traditional 12 to 14 years that it took to get a single vaccine out. This shows you the power of collaboration and unity. This is an evidence of the world integrating successfully. The movements of young people, the protests going on, the anti-Black racism protests, the climate protests, the collaboration of young people and older people to create a better world, the fact that more people are just more aware and more engaged. These are all evidences of integration. So when a caterpillar shifts from being a caterpillar to a butterfly, it eventually cocoons itself and excretes enzymes that literally destroy its own body. But in the middle of that caterpillar are imaginal discs that are just small clusters of cells that then, during this disintegrative process, start developing and accelerating and growing rapidly, and they become the parts of the butterfly. When you look at what happens in the cocoon, it looks messy and disgusting and smelly and goopy, and you think, oh, I want to have nothing to do with it. And yet, as these simultaneous processes are going on, when they come to a climax, then you get the butterfly, the new creation. I think humanity is moving towards a new creation. And one of those creations is the building of a democratic world federation. And we should not be disheartened or depressed by all the evidences of disintegration. This is necessary. It is necessary for the current systems to collapse. It is necessary for things to get so bad that human beings in those autocratic countries will become so disillusioned that their conscience will be stirred, that they will be moved to action, and they will be moved to radically reconceptualize what they believe their societies should look like. That is a process we don't need to be involved in. It is happening. Our job, I think, our energies would be best spent building the new, not engaging in disassembling the old, and definitely not being disheartened by it. So that was my zoom out view to kind of re-inject hope, because with the way the discussion was going, it was like I was starting to feel like deflated.
Yes, I can relate. Jorge, yeah, we're over time, but if you have a question, please.
Yeah, it was a very brief reflection, which is when I went to Berlin and we had the Week for World Parliament event, and I talked to you, Easton. We sometimes enrolled in these conversations about strategy and big ideas, but we always ended up with the same thing, which was, okay, even if we have these huge projects of a world federation and we want to spread these ideas, we need to take concrete actions, and we need to focus on next steps. And right now, like the next steps I see regarding our association, Young World Federalists, is to have more members and to introduce more people here. We are 40 right now, or around 40, and we need to be thousands and hundreds of thousands. So before we can achieve this global change, we have several of next steps, which is to achieve each particular new member. And yeah, just to focus on next steps after talking about big ideas, which I always think is interesting.
Yes, I agree. We do need to have some concrete next steps. Yes. Which is what the activism, finding our salt, our symbolic thing, and what Andreas said, that it's quite difficult because there's no sort of institution. I mean, there's many. It's sort of a plethora. There's not a single one to choose from and to sort of identify. It's difficult.
So one of the beauties, by the way, of focusing on climate change is you can piggyback on, look at Greta Thunberg's group, okay? Started 2018, 14 million members. Okay, so it's doable. It is the existential crisis of our time. So why not start with that and say World Federation would solve this problem? Why not make that the thing? And then you can also you're able to then link arms with others who are issue focused, climate change focused, but then say we have a larger solution that would address this issue. And then later, once people see that it's successful in addressing why it might be successful in addressing this issue, then you can think about building it out. So that's a thought for next steps. Look at the Thunberg model and see if you can follow it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we need some solo protesters to start it. Someone to sit outside the UN every day on Friday. I nominate Jorge. Okay, on that.
All the days, Fridays, vegan.
Yeah.
Thursdays, Mondays.
Yeah, all the days. Okay, on that, I will thank our guests for being here, Sovaida and Tim and Andreas. I thank you so much. It was very enlightening discussion and fun and interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks, Tim. It was a delight meeting you. And obviously, Andreas, who's left, I'd met him before, but thank you for a wonderful, energetic consultation.
Yeah. Lovely meeting you all. Thank you for pushing us back into the zone of positivity there. So we needed it.
Yeah.
And keep up the good work. And Easton, don't forget I would like to see some young World Federalists pushing the ET agenda.
Okay, well. We have it's not explicitly, but if you on our website, the Go Beyond campaign is it's this purple, this dark purple color with a spaceship. That's sort of our science and sci-fi one. But
let's make it explicit. Don't throw Jorge under the bus though on this one.
Okay, I won't. Yeah, it's too common. Okay, thank you very much for your time. And now I will turn to, we have an award to give to two esteemed people who've helped us and who volunteered for us and advised us. Nicholas, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Easton. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Well, this year we are presenting for the first time the YWF Young at Heart Award. The YWF Young at Heart Award is presented by the Young World Federalist to recognize leaders who exemplify a spirit of mentorship, enthusiasm, and determination. The Young at Heart Award is designed to honor these individuals as a way to recognize their contribution to the movement for World Federation and the young people who champion it. This year's winners are Donna Park and John Vlasto. John Vlasto is not able to join us today. So Donna Park, if you would like to say a few words, you're welcome to.
Thank you. I saw John was here for a minute. Did you see his Zoom window?
Yeah, he's in a taxi in the Scotland Highlands. Yeah.
And here I was thinking he was at COP26, like marching with Greta, trying to win Greta over to our side. Darn. Well, maybe he is. Let's not, Anyway, yes, I thank you so much. I'm really honored and humbled and just delighted to receive the Young at Heart Award, your Young at Heart Award. I have to say that I guess we've been working together now a little over a year. I can't remember exactly when we started, but you guys have just completely lifted my spirits. Working for World Federation has been, I've only been at it about 10 years, not as long as Sovaida. I had another career, and when I retired, I read a couple books. I read about this idea of a democratic World Federation. I was like pissed that I hadn't heard of it before, and decided that that's how I would spend my retirement, working for World Federation. But it's been a bit of a slodge until you guys came on the scene. And because even though I'm old compared to you, I'm young compared to many of the others in the movement. So I just couldn't imagine what was going to happen to the movement, because I was like one of the younger people. Sovaida's younger, but just Sovaida, that was about it, and the Baha'is. So anyway, I'm just so excited to work with you guys, because you just give me hope, and you teach me new technology, which we all need, and I'm just energized. So thank you, and I'm delighted if there's any way I can help. I feel like you guys need the old people, because the old people have the money, and so my goal is to try to figure out how to connect us so we can better use the money that the old people have generated to help you guys. And we need you because you are the future, you and my grandchildren who are a little younger than you. So my oldest grandson is 10. I'm hoping that pretty soon he'll be able to join you guys. So I'm working on that too.
Great.
So anyway, thank you. I'm sorry if I rambled, but thank you very much. I'm really honored and delighted and humbled. Thanks.
And thank you, Donna. It's been almost 2 years, but every
Has
step
it?
of the way, almost, yeah. But
Wow.
you've been supporting us every step of the way.
And I know John has too. I wish John could be here because John is always there, and he's another great guy. So it's fun to receive it with John.
Yeah,
Yes.
we wanted to do 2 World Federalists of different genders.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Trying to support the gender
Yeah.
parity.
I do feel like I kind of let you down on I tried to start a women's channel or get involved in the Discord channel. And I realized I'm too old. I engaged, but it didn't work. And there are just some things that old people can't do. And that seems to be one of them.
We can't do it either, Donna. So don't worry
Don't
about
worry,
that.
We
Okay.
struggle. And I will, I'm in Glasgow with John. We just talked yesterday for like 2 hours. We were sitting in COP talking about the world. He's now the chair of the executive committee. So he's the leader of the global movement.
Yes.
So yeah, we were having a really long chat, and yeah, I'll meet up with him this week and buy him a beer and we'll have a heart to heart. So I promise that there'll also be some more celebrating with John. And I thank you both so much. Yeah, Donna, it's been incredible working with you, and I thank you very much. Yeah, and with the
Thanks.
CGS partnership as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
So with that, we're sort of at the end of the the inaugural Young World Federalist Global Assembly. It's been 3 days of fun. So we started out with the election. So we have 2 new board members, Jorge, who's on the call, and Alec Neely. Sorry, Jorge, I'm not even going to try to say your last name. Great. And then we added some changes to the policy platform submitted by members, passed a resolution, a political declaration. That'll be refined and put on the website soon. And then yesterday we had a really enlightening conversation with Shimri Zemaret about civil resistance for World Federation. And I think what I've really taken away is this search for our salt. I love the metaphor of what he provided with the Gandhi and the independence movement in India, and using salt as a symbol. And I think that's a great project that we can begin to undertake and sort of hopefully infuse that into the theory of change process that's going on in the World Federalist Movement right now. So that's my little summary. I don't know, Nick, if you had anything you wanted to add before we close.
I just wanted to thank everyone who's come these past 3 days and who's going to be watching this on our YouTube channel afterwards. We have accomplished a lot in the past 2 years, and I feel like this assembly has been a good way of reflecting on the progress we've made. And I'm excited for the next assembly next year.
Yeah,
Thank
me
everyone.
too. That's a great way to end it. Yeah, here's to looking forward to next year. And yeah, I thank you all for your
Eston,
time.
you'll be up for election next year.
Yeah, great.
You better worry.
That's the pressure. So I thank you so much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.